quite intimidating position of becoming a keynote speaker, although I must say that perhaps Zsuzsa László and Dora Hegyi could have been here instead of me, because I owe them all my interest in exhibition histories. It's been 12 years ago when I participated in I think it was the opening conference of the Parallel Chronologies Project, the Invisible History of Exhibitions conference in Budapest, that basically started my interest for exhibition theories and histories, and I continued this interest until today and hopefully in the future. So without further ado, I'll start delivering my lecture, which in a way is meant to be a sort of dialogue with one of Edith András's texts that I will refer in this introduction. So in a key article entitled "What Does East Central European Art History Want?", Edith András claims that post-socialist art history in the region was characterized by the will to be recognized as being on a par with Western art history, manifesting a strong desire to belong to a national, regional, and finally global discourses, canons, and institutions. After the discipline lost its usefulness in shaping national identity, it has attempted to reposition itself and adapt to post-colonial and more recently decolonial narratives, driving the global conversations and to integrate the epistemic forces active within these narratives. Although Edith András claims that regional art history is today a project to be abandoned, I would like to interrogate in my talk the potential needs and benefits of turning towards exhibitions as particular objects of art historical study within and of the region. In short, why study exhibitions from a regionally situated perspective? How does this impact the writing of art history as a discipline, its situated conundrums, as well as the other histories of exhibitions in various other places? What are the pitfalls, the difficulties and advantages, perhaps, of such a study? Despite agreeing with Edith András that these exhibitions are not to be considered today in isolation from a wider, perhaps globally entangled perspective, including both the capitalist colonial West and the global South, I believe that studying exhibitions can be used both as a telescope and as a convex mirror to reflect unquestioned assumptions, prejudices, matters of concern, and blind spots in art historiographic writing in the region. I will work today with three main concepts. That is, where should I point this to? Maybe I can stay here. I can stay. Just click. Which is that of constellation, the concept of transposition and heterochrony that I believe to be useful in analyzing exhibitions in order to reflect on other key art historical notions such as canons of art history, narrative, medium, and networks. My final suggestion will be that perhaps the history of exhibitions itself might benefit from moving away from an unquestioned model of exhibitions as representational apparatuses towards an understanding of the exhibition as an event. And conversely, that our history might borrow from the practice of exhibition making or curatorial epistemology, a move away from its infatuation with explanatory totalizing narratives and fixed meanings towards a performative model of becoming public as image-making, effective, and plurivocal cultural production. Let us start with the first question. So, if exhibitions are a particular object of study, are they a specific class of art historical objects? To this question, it appears to me with increasing evidence that exhibitions are elastic media, as well as plurifunctional objects of inquiry. Their diversity does not allow us to characterize them in separation from the space and time of their materialization, and there cannot be a homogeneous methodology fitted for all. The variety of exhibitions that I only incompletely exemplify here prove that the art exhibition is particularly resistant to unification. The fact that in their form, function, and motivations to exist, exhibitions are inherently tied with a particular space-time continuum, make them singular ontological entities. They are, in other words, inherently situated cultural objects and convey in-place meanings. And this will become particularly important in the last part of my talk, especially in relation with comparative art history, and even more so in the case of devising a comparative history of exhibitions. Moreover, unlike many other image of object-based practices, exhibitions are temporary, fleeting instances of coming together in public, which assemble artworks into singular networks of relations, and whose effects are at the same time aesthetic, epistemic, and performative. Their afterlife, like in the case of performance art, largely depends on their documentation. Their reconstruction is even more difficult given the multiplicity of agents involved in their construction, the variety of documents, including oral testimonies of participants and members of the public, administrative and personal letters, exhibition plans if there are any, press releases and art critical reviews, etc., and the scarcity of visual documentation, which often relies on exhibition shots. Before becoming an object of study, exhibitions were and are still used in the region as instruments of making instead of just writing critical art history. Such exhibitions, based on curatorial research that took up the task of rewriting art history in a different medium and form, sometimes benefiting from the art historical input of multinational research teams, are themselves worthy of a separate study. They attempted, nevertheless, to supplement missing art historical narratives, to amend the lack of empirical knowledge and archival documentation. Particularly important were exhibitions that undertook the politically emancipatory function of addressing biases in existing national art historical narratives. Many of these were meant to challenge and amend a white, male-based art historical canon and narrative that was for long shared with Western art history. A famous example of this kind, and perhaps debatable example, is the Gender Check project curated by Bojana Pejic with the help of a multinational research team and installed at MUMOC in Vienna in 2010. It would perhaps be interesting to evoke in this context exhibitions that perform the task of historicizing exhibitions in an exhibition form, not as singular moments in time, but as invitations to further research local and regional art historical context. For instance, the exhibition Three Women, curated by Eva Toniak at Zaketa, National Gallery of Art, Warsaw, 2011, which brought into dialogue the works of three major Polish women artists, echoing the previous exhibition with the same title installed at Arsenal Gallery, Poznan in 1978, through the collective work of Anna Bedjanuk, Izabela Gustowska, and Krynia or Krystyna Piotrowska. I'm sorry if I mispronounced the names. Through a procedure that Rita Greenberg catalogued as a reef. While such examples contribute to national and transnational art history, remembering cultural events that otherwise would turn quickly into oblivion given their temporariness, such exhibitions are examples of writing our history in a different form. And here I arrive to an important point about how exhibition forms may challenge art historical narratives, and thus to the question of how studying exhibitions might not mean simply replicating the dominant narratives. As historical objects of study, so this is the following part of my presentation, exhibitions may be approached through the Benjaminian concept of the dialectical image. That is, they bring the past into present and simultaneously link the present to past. Recuperate, reinvent, reinterpret, revalue, reimagine the past for the present. According to Walter Benjamin, it's not what is past casts its light on what is present, or what is present its light on what is past. Rather, the dialectical image is that wherein what has been comes together in a flash with the now to form a constellation. Image is dialectics at a standstill. End of quotation. The dialectical image is both an object of historical circumspection and an optic through which normative historical narratives are critiqued. So the exhibitions may appear, therefore, as a field of forces which disturbs art history rather than as a micro-narrative which should be inserted into the dominant existing ones. I would like to introduce at this point two more analytical concepts borrowed from curatorial theorist Beatrice von Bismarck, which may be particularly useful in understanding how the history of exhibitions may challenge this conundrum expressed at the beginning of my talk, namely, how can regional art history be reconciled with the global? The first concept I would like to introduce is that of transpositionality. That is, the new position acquired because of movement. Thus, I turn towards the performative effects of exhibitions in spatial terms, which may help us interrogate their relevance for the geography of art. From this perspective, exhibitions move objects, either from the studio or the collection to the gallery space, or from the gallery to various para-exhibitionary sites, as well as from the local to the international. But they also move people, images, and ideas across different cultural and political contexts of reception. This allows the art historian to follow the circulation of objects, images, and artists within different networks. That is, what do they exhibit and to whom? To take into account forms of technologies of visibility and making visible, and to instantiate actual encounters of artists and juxtaposition of artworks through exhibitions, answering the question, how are these objects framed and contextualized? Assessing the transnational circulation of Eastern European artists allow us to place art history firmly within a broader horizon, while attempting to smoothen out the national elements still present in the narrative. However, researching it through the exhibition network may also reveal prejudices active when considering artworks in isolation from their context of circulation and public exposure. For instance, it may further undermine the dichotomy between official and unofficial art and artists that were present in both types of networks, as well as between space-supported and independent art spaces, revealing artists that were traveling through various heterogeneous networks, as well as transversal and lateral connections constructed through innovative exhibition formats. Another important aspect that may be laid bare by researching the material infrastructure of exhibitions is the alleged horizontality of artistic travel. Not only that a materialist historical approach might show the biases, differences in financial access, difficulties of communicating to foreign audiences, but they may also reveal motivations for sponsoring cultural events, be it state sponsorship or other type of support. And even the lack of such sponsorship in the case of inventing forms of communicating artistic ideas, such as self-produced artist books, Xerox art, performance art, language-based conceptual art pieces, or mail art. Such an analysis also reveals the imbrication between politics and exhibitions as forms of national and ideological construction of identity through artistic representation, without reducing the exhibition to a political factor or background. The last concept, and I'll go to some real analysis. Such analyses are facilitated by approaching the exhibition not as a sequential arrangement of images in space or as a narrative, but rather as a constellation. According to Beatrice von Bismarck, a constellation is, I quote, a flexible relational structure linking individual elements that are themselves subject to change. It thus captures a moment in the configuration of elements that is unstable and ephemeral, and it presents unfinished stages of coming together, end of quotation. So the constellation is not a given structure, but a temporary construct, an assemblage of fixed and moving positions. It is heterogeneous, elastic, able to create new associations. It is rhizomatic, that is horizontal, decentralized, with multiple points of entrance and exit. It is networked. It is partially non-narrative, that is polyphonic. And it is holistic in the sense that the meaning of the whole supersedes and results at the same time from the interconnections of its individual elements. So changing the arrangement within an exhibition would result in changing its meanings and perhaps its performativity. Using this analytical concept is particularly useful in challenging the undisputed centrality of notions of narrative and chronology in our history through the import of visual thinking. It is also in Adorno and Benjamin's writings that we find montage as a technique of constructing constellations. As a visual articulation, it breaks open narratives, undermines causal connections and hierarchical distributions. Montage allows not for fixed images and meanings, but for processes of coming together, advocating thus an inherently unfinished historiography, which lays bare the processes of becoming visible and thus elaborates the potentialities that perhaps were not actualized by these exhibitions in their own time. However, more concrete consequences of the curatorial thinking in terms of constellations for writing our history, looking from these particular margins, as Piotr Piotrowski famously described the situations, look coming from East Central Europe, concern the methodology of comparative analysis, or what Thomas Pospisil has dubbed as associative art history. Namely, it opens up the possibility of inserting artworks into new networks with perhaps unexpected and formerly perhaps never accomplished associations with artworks simultaneously produced in other regions. In relation to transpositionality, my methodological proposal would perhaps be to create a comparative study of exhibitions taking into account how a certain artwork moved across different types of exhibitions and context of reception, and thus to allow for a story to cross the local, national, translocal, regional and transregional levels. It would be important to reveal how artworks were set into dialogue, proximity or opposition in different exhibition contexts. Thus, one might reconstruct a cultural history of the objects themselves, something methodologically akin to both social art history, reception theory, and object biography. It would also allow us to illuminate differences between each situation of public presentation, as well as between its publics, and the constellation of constraints that operated upon the regimes of becoming public, including political censorship, discursive technologies of exclusion and marginalization through curatorial selection, display, focalization, and textual interpretation, together with the very notions of the public sphere and the regimes of visibility that its exhibitions are associated with. Apologize for this interruption. So perhaps one interesting example of attempting this is this research project that Zakenta Gallery was also part of, and which was called the Other Transatlantic, Kinetic and Op Art in Eastern Europe and Latin America, 1950s and 1970s. Last but not least, it would become important to study the documentation of exhibitions per se and their paraphernalia as cultural objects from the perspective of visual studies. What type of photographic images are used? Who captured those images and how? What type of photographic gaze do they invite or relate to? And what type of posterity do they envision? What type of invitations, for instance, and posters are accompanying it as a public discourse? And what type of design do they employ? Hence, we arrive at the fraught relationship between the transpositional work of exhibitions and their capacity to act as cultural facilitators. Biennials, and in their either national or transnational formats, Juliane Debuscher, for instance, had a very good study on this in the Institute of the Present. I'm recalling that. Were the privileged type of exhibitions to act as vectors of cultural translation and transference, facilitating transnational encounters among artists from Eastern Europe and artists beyond the Eastern Bloc. While they offer a fertile ground to assess and perhaps criticize unidirectional notions such as influence, and to address the questions of cultural translation and transculturation, for which perhaps Mary-Louise Pratt's concept of the contact zone, understood as a site where different groups struggle for recognition outside their original localities, may serve as an appropriate theoretical framework. One should also pay attention not only to the existing contacts among artists, some of which lasted for long in the form of intellectual friendships, but also to the imaginary space of encounter, which artists and artworks facilitated by the traveling exhibitions during the Cold War and the types of artistic identities and meanings that these exhibitions projected to different audiences. Examples of exhibitions that moved across the Iron Curtain include 15 Polish painters at MoMA 1969, the traveling exhibitions of Henry Moore that we have already heard about and we hope to hear more in the future, or the American art exhibitions traveling to many countries, including Romania, such as the disappearance or reappearance of image American paintings since 1945 in the 60s. Thus, it would allow us to assess the misunderstandings and the failed encounters which occur when analyzing exhibitions such as Works and Worlds, and this has already been done by Clara Kempwatch and Zsuzsa Laszlo, as a watershed moment in the construction of the Eastern European art umbrella, as well as to their discursive functions, conveying artistic identity often in national terms. And this is also perhaps one of the key problems that we're facing, because whenever we attempt to do this, we simply go back, after all, to the national element. Last but not least, speaking from Central and Eastern Europe, one cannot avoid the socialist identity historically underpinning the region. From such a perspective, it is worth studying the form and function of the diplomatic exhibitions as representational, cultural, and transpositional apparatuses, and perhaps open up a study of the lateral connections within the Global South, recently addressed by the current handbook project Socialist Exhibition Cultures, which is a team effort coordinated by Sven Speaker, Bojana Vidikanic, and Polly Savage, which includes, among many others, Gabriela Schwittek, Zsuzsa Laszlo, and myself from here. Although, unfortunately, I have reached the concluding part of my talk, I would like to briefly mention, and Daniel I should also mention, and there are many others that I forget to mention, so I should add to this. The book is unfinished, so I don't know if we will receive all these proposals that were initially meant to be there. Although, unfortunately, I have reached the concluding part of my talk, I would like to briefly mention other possible responses to another question. What can the history of exhibitions as a discipline, and here are particularly important to study the festivals. I'm returning, this is from the Festival of Youth and Students in Moscow in 1967, as well as the imbrication between politics and cultural diplomacy. This is an opening of an exhibition, and perhaps what today was mentioned as the rituals, opening rituals, because here we have the presidents that always attend these openings and construct relations, the Romanian case. So the final question, what can exhibition history as a discipline learn from Central and Eastern Europe, if it can? This question raises another question concerning the canon of exhibition history that, as an academic discipline, it unfortunately tends to replicate. What exhibitions do we choose to study and why? And what do these reveal about our present condition and perhaps unacknowledged collective desires? For the past 10 years, the attempts of writing exhibition histories in the region has shifted from an urgent need to fill in gaps in art historical knowledge by retrieving documentations of locally significant events that would have the potential to fit into larger narratives and to enter in dialogue with better known art exhibitions, especially those from France, UK, and the USA, as well as with other exhibitions from the Eastern Bloc, to a research of transnational and international touring exhibitions. In brief, there has been 4 main categories of exhibitions under study so far: diplomatic exhibitions, museum national identity building exhibitions, which respond to national and international scales of analysis, transnational exhibitions, analyzed mostly as discursive practices, and local, self-managed experimental exhibitions, analyzed in relation to their site specificity, the semiotics of the exhibition space and the relation to the public sphere. As you have seen, a brief selection of some attempts to do what I have mentioned, that is, to write exhibition histories in East Central Europe, to which I should also add the book edited by Maria Orishkova that is not in the slides, but it's worth mentioning at least. And taking a hasty look at the radical, challenging, and innovative formats which expanded and redefined the medium of the exhibition, in art produced in the region between 1960 and 1989, a salient characteristic is the performative and conceptual aspect of exhibitions. These aspects constantly undermine the representational function. Another striking feature for me is that these exhibitions do not circulate artistic objects, but rather construct aesthetic situations and interrogate institutional and existential conditions of artistic reception. So the shift from the exhibition as a representational technology to the exhibition as a performative event associated with a speech act rather than with an articulated discourse generates tentative typologizations, which may contribute to characterizing the exhibition as an unstable object of study. Approached from this situated perspective, the exhibition becomes perhaps what Miquebal defined as a theoretical object. That is not a passive object on which predetermined theories should be projected, but cultural events that force us to theorize, to think not only about them, but with them and through them. Borrowing terms from a history of dissenting exhibitions in Latin America sketched by Olga Fernandez Lopez, and constructive tentative categories of my own, I have instantiated several types of exhibitions, many already documented in collective projects such as the already mentioned parallel chronologies. The first one is the participative exhibition, exemplified by, for instance, the group exhibition Hit Parade, destroyed on the opening day because the public understood it as an invitation to simply destroy the works on display. Or the Sum 660 environment by Slobodan Dimitrievich, consisting of 680 painted cans of food which could be rearranged by the audience, and this photograph lying on the floor, which were curated by Željko Košević at the Student Centrum Gallery in Zagreb. The curatorial work of Košević and Vjeran Zupa for the exhibition of Women and Men installed at Student Center Gallery Zagreb in 1967 can also be recalled in this respect, although it was usually connected with conceptual art. The second category would comprise conceptual exhibitions which reflected, and Julius Kohler's Ping Pong Club. The second category comprises conceptual exhibitions which reflected on the institutional condition of exhibition and the significance of becoming an artist, as well as on the semiotics of the gallery space, such as the Goran Tribuljac's conceptual art anti-exhibitions, again in Student Central Zagreb in 1968 and 1973, that we probably all know about. I tried to choose very well-known examples today, such as I do not want to show anything new and original, or the fact that somebody is given the opportunity to make an exhibition is more important than what is shown at that exhibition, or perhaps the artistic work of the curator taken over by Košević in the 1972 installation of the postal consignment section in the 7th Paris Biennale has been already mentioned here, which he decided not to open and to display the packages as such. And perhaps another category of exhibitions that needs to be contextualized is the one tentatively named after Lopez exhibitions as encounters, such as the Balaton Bogla 1972, a lot has been written about it, the meeting of Czech and Hungarian artists, or the Symposium 74, which were characterized by collaborative works, performance-based pieces subsumed under the premises of transnational solidarity and artistic sociality, but whose documentation in the form of posters and replaces the actual exhibition and functions both as a catalog and as a space for display. Last but not least, one should further interrogate the category of exhibitions as laboratories, which would include discursive exhibitions in which theorizing about art replaced its presentation, as well as spatial environments that intersect art and science, sometimes transforming the gallery space into an artist's studio. In all these types of exhibitions, it is perhaps noticeable not only the resonance with other major conceptual and performative exhibitions, perhaps in an attempt to challenge the centrality and the exceptionality of exhibitions, such as when exhibitions become form or Oplosse-Schroeven in the exhibition Histories. And most of these were so far, such as Bruce Altschuler's exhibition that made art history, focused on perhaps a Western canon of exhibitions, but also the dialogue that these exhibitions enable today with Latin American exhibitions with similar, perhaps, features, albeit manifested in a different chronotype, and which, crucially, in my opinion, look back at us from a different margin. So in writing what I would call entangled exhibition histories in Central and Eastern Europe, it is crucial to denounce the obsession with primacy, originality, and belatedness, which are simply transferred from modernist art history alongside the notion of the canon, a notion that, despite coming under intense scrutiny, seems to stubbornly return. And this would enable us to work with temporal cuts in an expanded cultural field. Researching the history of exhibitions from the 70s, for instance, one may look at the interference among locally produced art theories, the kind that Jerzy Ludwinski, Jerzy Beresch, Karl Friedrich Klaus, or Andrei Kosztolowski devised, key conceptual art writings of the time, translations from other writers that were circulating, and political writers that may become relevant for each national situation. At the same time, in order to understand the emergence of such exhibition forms, one must investigate the elasticization of the media of sculpture, photography, graphics, and painting, and their effects on envisaging exhibitions as environments, publics, and living sculptures, as well as their visual display as only one among many other aesthetic communicational technologies. Finally, it is important to acknowledge why such a study would be relevant for the present moment we stand in, looking at the past. So besides the exhibition as an expanded medium, embedded in unconventional forms of documentation and communication, and its experimental blurring of the boundaries between media and representational formats, one can grasp perhaps in the current lingering interest in the 60s and 70s exhibition in Central and Eastern Europe, a nostalgia for a different possible form of sociality and a different structure of the art field, which is echoed in the 90s by groundbreaking exhibitions of relational art or the collective and experimental exhibitions such as Hans-Ulrich Obricht's Laboratory or Do It, whose already existing history of similar events in East Central Europe passes unacknowledged by writers such as Jens Hoffmann. So, from the perspective of the present, I believe that we may find in such exhibitions a challenge to the already commodified, distributed tasks of curatorial activity within the capitalist knowledge production. This challenge lies in frequently exchanging positions between curators, who acted as artists, and artists who acted as curators, as well in collective curating and in the collaborative forms of artistic productions. The latter are yet to be interrogated, I believe, according to the notion of intellectual solidarity, as well as from the perspective of affect theory. Thank you.